The crack of lightning split the evening sky as Thessaly Brightwater pressed her face against the rain-streaked window of Pemberton's elite equestrian auction house. Inside, beneath the glittering chandeliers, millionaires in tailored suits raised platinum cards worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Outside, clutching a crumpled dollar bill in her calloused palm, stood a 17-year-old girl whose entire world was about to change. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the marble floors as lot after lot of championship bloodlines sold for astronomical sums. Thessaly had walked 12 miles through the storm, her worn sneakers squelching with every step, drawn by whispers she'd heard at the feed store about a special horse being sold tonight. A horse that nobody wanted. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the auctioneer's tone shifted, becoming almost apologetic. We present lot 47. Storm's Requiem, a 4-year-old stallion of unknown lineage deemed unsuitable for training. The heavy curtains parted and gasps echoed through the auction house. A magnificent black stallion stood trembling in the spotlight, his coat gleaming like obsidian despite the wild terror in his dark eyes. Scars crisscrossed his flanks, telling stories of failed attempts to break his spirit. His mane hung entangled, knots and dried mud caked his hooves, yet something regal remained in the arch of his neck, the proud tilt of his head. This animal has proven impossible to train, the auctioneer continued, his embarrassment palpable. Multiple injuries to handlers, destroyed property, and an unfortunate incident involving Senator Blackthorn's prize roses. We begin bidding. At $500. Silence. The kind of thick, uncomfortable silence that pressed against eardrums like cotton. Not a single platinum card moved. The wealthy patrons shifted in their velvet seats, some checking their phones, others whispering. About the next lot, the stallion's breathing came in sharp bursts, his nostrils flaring as he sensed the rejection, the disdain radiating from every corner of the opulent room. In the back corner, Cordelia Vanderberg adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet and leaned toward her companion. "Darling Quentin," she drawled, her voice carrying perfectly in the hushed space. "Surely they don't expect civilized people to bid on that creature. It's practically feral." Quentin Ashworth III, heir to the Ashworth shipping fortune, chuckled as he straightened his platinum cufflinks. "My dear Cordelia, that beast belongs in a glue factory, not a stable. Look at those scars. It's clearly defective merchandise." Their laughter tinkled like wind chimes in a hurricane, sharp and out of place. Other auction-goers nodded in agreement, their faces twisted with disgust as they stared at the trembling stallion. The horse seemed to understand their judgment, his head dropping lower with each cruel word. "400? The auctioneer tried desperately. 300. Surely someone sees potential in this unique animal. That's when Thessaly's hand found the door handle. The brass felt ice-cold under her palm, but she pushed through anyway, her dollar bill clutched so tightly that Abraham Lincoln's face had worn smooth under her thumb. Every head turned as the massive doors creaked open, and a girl who clearly didn't belong stepped into their glittering world. Her jeans were patched at the knees, her flannel shirt hung loose over a frame too thin from skipping meals to save for feed, and her dark hair was plastered to her skull from the rain. But her eyes blazed with something the millionaires had long forgotten. Pure, unwavering hope. The stallion's head snapped up, and for the first time that evening, he stopped, trembling. "Security!" Cordelia's voice sliced through the stunned silence like a blade through silk. "There's obviously been some mistake. This is a private auction, not a charity event." Thessaly's cheeks burned as every pair of eyes in the auction house fixed on her soaked form, but she forced herself to keep walking down the center aisle. Her sneakers squeaked against the polished marble with each determined step, announcing her presence to anyone who might have missed the spectacle of her entrance. Quentin rose from his seat, his 6-foot frame imposing in his $1,000 suit. "Young lady," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension, "I believe you're lost. The livestock auction is across town, though I doubt you could afford even the sick cattle there." Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd like poison, spreading through water. Thessaly felt each chuckle like a physical blow, but she kept her eyes fixed on the stallion, Storm's requiem had turned toward her completely now, his intelligent eyes tracking her movement with an intensity that made her heart race. "Perhaps she's here to clean the stables," suggested Marlowe Pennington, adjusting his monocle for a better look at the intruder. "Though I wouldn't trust her with my daughter's pony, let alone a beast like that one." The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously, unsure how to handle the unprecedented situation. In 30 years of conducting sales for the elite, he'd never encountered anything like this rain-soaked girl, who clearly had no business in his auction house. "Miss," he began diplomatically, "this is indeed a private event. Perhaps you're looking for—" "I'm here to bid," Thessaly interrupted, her voice stronger than she felt. She pulled the crumpled dollar from her pocket, smoothing it against her thigh with hands that shook only slightly. "On the horse." The explosion of laughter that followed could have shattered crystal. Cordelia actually fell back into her seat, fanning herself with her bidding paddle as tears of mirth streamed down her powdered cheeks. Quentin doubled over, slapping his knee as if he'd just heard the world's funniest joke. $1, he wheezed between guffaws. "Oh, this is rich, absolutely rich. Darling, did you hear? The little vagrant wants to buy a horse with lunch money." "Someone call the newspapers," Marlowe added, wiping his eyes with a silk handkerchief. "This is the most entertainment I've had all season. Local urchin attempts to purchase thoroughbred with pocket change." But while the crowd dissolved into hysteria, something remarkable was happening in the spotlight. Storm's requiem had begun. Moving toward the edge of his platform, as close to Thessaly as his lead rope would allow. His ears, which had been pinned back in aggression all evening, now pointed forward with keen interest. The trembling that had racked his powerful frame since the auction began gradually subsided. "The minimum bid remains at $300, the auctioneer said, though his voice lacked conviction. He glanced nervously at the security guards stationed near the exits, clearly wondering if he should have the girl removed. "I don't have $300, Thessaly admitted, her voice cutting through the continued snickering. "I have $1, but I'll work for the rest. I'll clean every stall in your stable, muck every paddock, scrub every water trough until my debt is paid." Quentin's laughter grew even louder. "Oh, precious child, do you have any idea what that animal is worth? Even as damaged goods, he's worth more than you'll earn in your entire pathetic lifetime." "Besides," Cordelia added, fanning herself more vigorously, "what would someone like you do with a horse? You probably live in some dreadful little hovel without proper facilities. The poor beast would die of neglect within a week." Their words should have crushed her spirit, should have sent her fleeing back into the storm with her tail between her legs. But Thessaly found strength in an unexpected source, the horse himself. Storm's requiem had stretched his neck as far as the rope allowed, his muzzle nearly touching the barrier that separated them. In his dark eyes, she saw something the Millionaire's couldn't: recognition, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, hope. "He doesn't belong here," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying over the dying laughter. "Not with people who see him as broken merchandise. He belongs with someone who sees what he really is." "And what exactly do you think he is?" Quentin challenged, his tone mocking. Thessaly looked directly at the stallion, her heart swelling with certainty. "He's magnificent." The auction house fell silent as if someone had cast a spell over the glittering assembly. Even Cordelia's fan stopped its rhythmic flutter. For a moment, the only sounds were the patter of rain against the tall windows and Storm's requiem's soft nickering, a sound he hadn't made all evening until now. The auctioneer fidgeted with his gavel, completely out of his depth. "Miss, I'm afraid the rules are quite clear. The minimum bid is $300 and payment must be $1, Thessaly repeated, stepping closer to the platform. The stallion stretched toward her again, and she could see her own reflection in his dark eyes. "That's my bid." Quentin had recovered from his laughter enough to stand, his face now flushed with indignation rather than amusement. "This charade has gone on long enough. Security should remove this person immediately. She's disrupting a legitimate business transaction." "Actually," came a voice from the back of the room, crisp and authoritative, "she has every right to bid All heads turned toward the speaker, Judge Cornelius Hawthorne, a distinguished man in his 70s whose word carried weight even among the wealthy elite. He rose slowly from his seat, his silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers. The advertisement for tonight's auction stated, "All welcome with proper financial backing," he continued, his legal mind working with precision. It made no mention of minimum bid requirements being absolute. If no one else is willing to bid, then any offer, however small, should be considered. The auctioneer's face paled. "Your Honor, with all due respect, surely you don't suggest—" "I suggest we follow the law," Judge Hawthorne replied firmly. "This young lady has made a legitimate offer. Are there any other bids?" The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Every millionaire in attendance had the means to outbid Thessaly 1,000 times over, but none wanted to waste money on what they considered damaged goods. Their pride, however, rebelled against the idea of losing to a girl with a dollar bill. "This is preposterous," Cordelia hissed, rising to her feet. "I won't be party to this mockery. $500. Her paddle shot into the air with theatrical flair, diamond bracelets catching the light like sparklers. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Finally, someone was restoring order to this circus, but Thessaly didn't flinch. $1.01, she said calmly. The crowd gasped. Cordelia's face turned the color of her ruby necklace. "You can't just keep adding pennies. $1,000. $1.02. This is insane," Quentin exploded, his composure finally cracking. $5,000. $1.03. The pattern continued, each millionaire's astronomical bid met by Thessaly's penny increase. The girl seemed unaware of the mathematical impossibility of her strategy, focused entirely on the horse who had begun moving restlessly in his spotlight, as if sensing the strange battle being fought over his fate. $25,000. Marlowe shouted, his monocle nearly falling from his eye. $1.25, Thessaly responded without hesitation. The absurdity of the situation began to dawn on the wealthy bidders. They were engaged in a bidding war they couldn't win, not because of money, but because of principle. Every time they raised the stakes, this slip of a girl responded with her impossible confidence, adding mere cents to her impossible bid. 50,000, Cordelia shrieked, her careful composure completely shattered. $1.50. And then, something unprecedented happened. Storm's Requiem threw back his head and let out a sound that stopped every heart in the auction. It wasn't a whinny or a neigh, it was deeper, more primal, like the cry of a wild creature recognizing its true home. The sound reverberated off the marble walls and crystal chandeliers, seeming to come from the very soul of the magnificent animal. But what happened next defied all explanation. As the stallion's cry echoed through the opulent space, something glistened on his dark cheek. A single, perfect tear traced a silver path down his face, catching the chandelier light like a fallen star. The auction house erupted into chaos. Some people gasped, others shouted in disbelief, and a few pulled out their phones to record what they were certain was an elaborate hoax. But those closest to the platform could see the truth in Storm's Requiem's eyes. This was no trick of the light or cleverly placed water. This was raw, genuine emotion from a creature they had dismissed as merely an animal. "Impossible," Quentin whispered, his face draining of color. "Horses they can't. But they could. And this one had. And somehow Thessaly wasn't surprised at all." The tear fell from Storm's Requiem's cheek and struck the platform with an audible splash that seemed to echo like thunder in the stunned silence. The stallion's eyes never left Thessaly's face, and in that gaze lay something that transcended the boundaries between human and animal. Pure, unbridled recognition. Judge Orr. Hawthorne was the first to break the spell, his weathered voice cutting through the chaos. "In 50 years of law practice, I've never witnessed anything like this. That horse—" He paused, studying the stallion with new eyes. "That horse knows her." "Ridiculous," Cordelia snapped, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. She clutched her pearl necklace like a lifeline, her knuckles white against the lustrous gems. Animals don't form emotional attachments to strangers. This is some sort of trained response, a parlor trick. But even as she spoke, Storm's Requiem took another step toward Thessaly, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his scarred coat. The lead rope pulled taut, and he tossed his head in frustration at the barrier keeping them apart. His nostrils flared as he breathed in her scent, and a soft rumble emanated from deep in his chest. Not aggressive, but welcoming. Thessaly extended. Her hand slowly, palm up, fingers steady despite the emotional hurricane swirling inside her chest. "Easy, beautiful," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed auction house. "I know you remember." "Remember?" Quentin scoffed, though he had unconsciously taken a step backward. "Remember what? You've never seen this horse before. In your life, haven't I?" Thessaly's eyes never left the stallion's face as she spoke. "Tell me, Mr. Ashworth, where did this horse come from? What's his history before he became unsuitable for training?" The auctioneer shuffled his papers nervously. The documentation is somewhat incomplete. He was found as a yearling, abandoned in the Appalachian foothills, severely malnourished, traumatized. The state took custody and eventually sold him to various trainers, but he proved difficult. Difficult because he was grieving, Thessaly said softly, taking another step closer to the platform. Because someone he loved disappeared from his life without explanation. Because every time humans tried to force him into submission, it reminded him of the last time he'd trusted completely. Storm's Requiem whinnied again, softer this time, but filled with such longing that several women in the audience dabbed at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs. The sound was heartbreaking in its humanity, a soul crying out across years of separation and pain. "This is melodramatic nonsense," Marlowe declared, though he too seemed shaken by the horse's response. "You're anthropomorphizing a simple animal reaction. The creature is merely responding to your calm demeanor after an evening of stress." Thessaly finally turned to face the crowd, her young face radiant with a mixture of joy and sorrow. 6 years ago, my family had a small farm in the mountains. We rescued abandoned animals, dogs, cats, and occasionally horses. One spring morning, we found a yearling colt trapped in a ravine, his mother dead from a lightning strike. He was barely alive, terrified, and heartbroken. She gestured toward Storm's Requiem, who had begun pawing at the platform, desperate to reach her. We nursed him back to health. I bottle-fed him, slept in his stall when he had nightmares, taught him to trust humans again. For 2 years, he was my shadow, my best friend, my heart walking around outside my body. Then what happened? "Judge?" Hawthorne asked gently, though something in his expression suggested he already knew the answer would be painful. "Bank foreclosure," Thessaly replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "We lost everything. The animals were seized as assets and sold to pay debts. I was 15, powerless to stop it. I searched for him everywhere, but he'd been sold to a trainer who moved out of state. I never stopped looking, never stopped hoping." She turned back to Storm's Requiem, who had grown completely still, as if understanding every word. "His registered name was different then. We called him Midnight's Dream, but I can see in his eyes that he remembers his real name, the one I whispered to him every night when the world was too big and scary for a traumatized colt." "And what name was that?" Cordelia asked despite herself. Caught up in the unfolding drama despite her skepticism, Thessaly smiled through her tears, an expression of pure love and recognition. "Thunder, because the sound of his hooves was like music, like hope, like the promise of better days ahead. At the sound of his true name, Storm's Requiem, Thunder threw back his head and trumpeted with such joy that the crystal chandelier above tinkled in harmonic response. This time, the tears flowed freely down his face and he strained against his lead rope with desperate urgency. The entire auction house sat in stunned silence, witnessing a reunion that defied logic, probability, and everything they thought they knew about the bond between human and animal. Even the most hardened millionaires found themselves moved by the raw emotion radiating from both girl and horse. But the auction wasn't over yet. The profound silence that followed Thunder's joyful cry was broken by the sound of Quentin Ashworth's platinum card hitting the marble floor. He stared at Thessaly and the stallion, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been shame. $100,000, he said suddenly, his voice tight with determination. I bid 100,000. The crowd gasped, and Thessaly felt her heart sink toward her worn sneakers. She looked down at her crumpled dollar bill, then back at Thunder, who was watching her with such trust and hope that it nearly broke her resolve. $1.51, she whispered, knowing how futile it sounded. 200,000, Cordelia shrieked, apparently deciding that pride was worth any price. I won't be shown up by some farm girl with delusions of grandeur. 300,000, Marlowe added, his competitive instincts overwhelming his earlier disdain. This has become a matter of principle. The bids flew fast and furious now, each millionaire determined not to be outdone by the others, their egos wounded by the very possibility that Thessaly's impossible strategy might succeed. They had forgotten entirely about the horse himself, focused only on winning at any cost. But Thessaly noticed something they didn't. With each escalating bid, Thunder became more agitated. His ears pinned back, his breathing grew shallow, and the joy that had radiated from him moments before was replaced by the same wild terror he'd shown at the beginning of the evening. He recognized the tone, the aggressive energy, the way humans fought over him like a possession rather than a living being with feelings and memories. 500,000, Quentin roared, his face red with exertion and embarrassment. $1.52, Thessaly said, but her voice was drowned out by Thunder's distressed whinny. That's when Judge Hawthorne stood again, his aged voice cutting through the chaos like a sword through silk. Enough. The bidding war stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. Every head turned toward the distinguished judge, who was studying the scene with the keen eye of someone who had spent decades weighing evidence and seeking truth. I've been observing this animal's behavior throughout the evening, he said slowly, each word measured and precise. When surrounded by your aggressive bidding and hostile energy, he becomes distressed, even violent. But when this young woman speaks, when she approaches, he transforms completely. The evidence is overwhelming. He pointed his silver-tipped cane toward Thunder, who was indeed straining toward Thessaly, despite the chaos around him. This horse has made his choice clear. The question isn't who can pay the most money, it's who truly belongs with whom. Your Honor, the auctioneer stammered. The legal requirements, Judge Hawthorne interrupted, state that the highest bid wins, but they also include provisions for special circumstances, including animal welfare concerns. I'm invoking Section 12B of the Auction Code, which allows for alternative resolution when an animal's well-being is at stake. Cordelia's fan snapped closed like a trap. What does that mean exactly? It means, the judge said with a slight smile, that we're going to settle this the old-fashioned way, with a test. He turned to address the room. Each bidder will be given the opportunity to approach this horse and demonstrate their connection with him. Whoever he responds to most positively will be deemed the rightful owner, regardless of their financial offer. The crowd erupted in protests and arguments, but Judge Hawthorne's reputation commanded respect. Even Quentin, despite his fury, couldn't argue with the logic or the legal precedent the judge was setting. Ladies first, Judge Hawthorne said, gesturing toward Cordelia. Mrs. Vanderberg, if you would. Cordelia straightened her designer dress and approached the platform with all the confidence her wealth could provide. She extended one perfectly manicured hand toward Thunder, her diamond rings catching the light like tiny suns. Thunder's response was immediate and unmistakable. He pulled back as far as his lead rope would allow, his eyes rolling white with fear. When Cordelia tried to step closer, he reared slightly, his front hooves striking the platform in warning. Next, Judge Hawthorne said diplomatically, as Cordelia retreated, her face flushed with humiliation. Marlowe fared no better, his approach met with pinned ears and bared teeth. Quentin's attempt resulted in Thunder spinning away entirely, presenting his hindquarters in a clear message of rejection. One by one, every millionaire in the auction house tried and failed to gain even the slightest positive response from the magnificent stallion. He seemed to see through their expensive clothes and jewelry to the coldness beneath, the way they viewed him as a commodity rather than a being worthy of love and respect. Finally, only Thessaly remained. She walked toward the platform slowly, her dollar bill still clutched in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thunder watched her approach with an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate with anticipation. When she was close enough to touch him, she stopped and simply stood there, letting him make the choice. For a long moment, they stared at each other, girl and horse, hearts recognizing hearts across years of separation and pain. Then Thunder stepped forward and gently pressed his forehead against hers, breathing out in a long sigh that seemed to release years of loneliness and fear. The stallion's tears began flowing again, but this time they were tears of pure joy, of coming home at last. The auction house had never witnessed anything like what happened next. As Thunder pressed his magnificent head against Thessaly's, a transformation rippled through the assembled crowd. The cynicism that had armor-plated their hearts began to crack, revealing something they'd forgotten in their pursuit of wealth and status: the capacity for wonder. Judge Hawthorne cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of final judgment. The winner of this auction is clear: Miss Thessaly Brightwater, with her bid of $1.52. Wait! Quentin stepped forward, his hand raised in desperate protest. This is madness. I bid $500,000. You can't seriously— Mr. Ashworth, the judge interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. In matters of the heart, money is often the poorest currency. This horse has made his choice, and the law supports animal welfare over financial gain. Thunder lifted his head from Thessaly's and trumpeted again, but this time the sound was pure triumph. The stallion seemed to grow larger before their eyes, his posture straightening, his scarred coat somehow gleaming brighter. This was no longer a broken animal to be pitied or feared. This was a magnificent creature who had found his way home. Thessaly fumbled with the clasp of her small purse, her hands shaking as she counted out her meager change. I have $1.57, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Will that cover the rest? Before the auctioneer could respond, Judge Hawthorne stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. My dear, I've been thinking about your offer to work off the debt. I happen to own a rather large estate that could use someone with your obvious gift for animals. Room, board, and a salary that would more than cover any remaining balance. Thessaly's eyes widened in disbelief. You would do that? For us? For you, yes. But more importantly, for him. The judge gestured toward Thunder, who was nuzzling Thessaly's hair with such tenderness that several women in the audience began crying openly. Some things are worth more than money, child. Love, loyalty, the bond between kindred spirits. These are the true treasures of life. That's when something unprecedented happened. Cordelia van der Berg, the woman who had mocked Thessaly most cruelly, stepped forward. Her perfectly composed face was streaked with tears, her diamond-encrusted fingers trembling as she reached into her purse. I want to contribute, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. $10,000 to help with his care, his rehabilitation. She looked directly at Thessaly, shame and wonder warring in her expression. I haven't felt anything this real in decades. Please let me do this one good thing. Marlowe nodded vigorously, pulling out his checkbook. $20,000 from me. For his medical expenses, his training, whatever he needs. One by one, every person who had mocked and dismissed Thessaly began pledging money, not to own Thunder, but to support his future with the girl who truly understood him. The donations poured in, 50,000, 100,000, enough to build a proper stable, hire veterinarians, purchase land. But perhaps the most surprising contribution came from Quentin Ashworth. The shipping heir approached slowly, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked remarkably like humility. Miss Brightwater, he said formally, I owe you an apology, several actually. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card. My family owns transportation companies worldwide. If you ever need to move your horse anywhere for competitions, medical care, whatever, it's on us. For life. Thessaly stared at the card, then at the man who had minutes ago been her cruelest tormentor. Why? Quentin glanced at Thunder, who was watching the exchange with intelligent eyes. Because watching you two, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. My grandfather started our company with nothing but a broken-down truck and a dream. He always said that the strongest bonds aren't bought. They're forged through love and hardship. He smiled ruefully. I think I lost sight of that somewhere along the way. The auctioneer, overwhelmed by the turn of events, simply handed Thessaly the ownership papers with a bewildered smile. I've never seen anything like this in 30 years, he admitted. Congratulations, miss. He's all yours. But Thessaly shook her head, looking up at Thunder with eyes full of love. No, she said softly, we belong to each other. As if understanding her words, Thunder lowered his great head and gently lipped the crumpled dollar bill from her palm. Instead of dropping it, he held it carefully in his teeth like a promise, like a symbol of the miracle that had just unfolded. The crowd watched in hushed amazement as girl and horse walked together toward the exit, surrounded by an aura of such perfect rightness that even the cynics found themselves believing in magic again. Outside, the storm had passed, and moonlight streamed through the clearing clouds, illuminating their path like a blessing. Behind them, the auction house buzzed with quiet conversation, but the tone had changed completely. People who had arrived, as strangers bound only by wealth, found themselves exchanging phone numbers, making plans for charity events, rediscovering the human connections that money couldn't buy. And somewhere in the distance, as Thessaly and Thunder disappeared into the silver night, the sound of hoofbeats echoed like thunder, like music, like the promise of all the beautiful tomorrows waiting just ahead. The girl with $1 had won the greatest prize of all. She had come home to her heart, and her heart had come home to her.